Dylan Carter woke up with a pounding headache and the uncomfortable feeling that he was definitely not in his own bed. For a few seconds, he just stared at the unfamiliar ceiling, tried to remember where he was and why his body felt so heavy. Rain tapped softly against nearby windows. The room smelled faintly like cologne, coffee, and laundry detergent. Then he felt warmth beside him. His heart nearly stopped. Slowly, he turned his head and saw Max Holloway asleep next to him. Not just any Max. The Max Holloway, captain of the university basketball team. Campus celebrity. The guy whose face was plastered all over posters, social media pages, and sports articles every other week. Blonde hair messy against the pillow, muscular bare chest half covered by tangled gray sheets, one arm resting near Dylan's waist like it had belonged there all night. Dylan immediately sat upright, so fast his head spun. Oh my God. Memories hit him in broken flashes. Loud music. Crowded apartment. Someone dragging him into a championship party he never wanted to attend. Rain pouring outside. Max sitting beside him on the balcony while everyone else drank and screamed inside. Shared headphones. Laughing over terrible music choices. Then that blackout. The entire building going dark for a few seconds while thunder shook the windows. And then the kiss. Dylan covered his face with both hands. No. His shirt was on the floor beside the couch. His jeans were halfway under the coffee table. He grabbed them quickly, trying not to look at the man still sleeping beside him. This had to be the worst decision of his life. He wasn't supposed to end up in situations like this. Guys like Max Holloway didn't wake up next to guys like Dylan Carter. As he pulled his hoodie over his head, a sleepy voice broke the silence. You always panic this much in a morning? Dylan froze. Max was awake now, leaning slightly against the headboard with tired blue eyes and messy hair. Somehow he still looked unfairly attractive. He rubbed one hand over his face and gave a small smile. You're leaving already? Dylan struggled to answer. Yeah. I should go. Why? The question caught him off guard. Max didn't sound embarrassed or awkward. If anything, he sounded disappointed. Dylan grabbed his backpack from the floor. I've got work later. It's 8 in the morning. That still counts as later. Max laughed quietly under his breath. Not mocking. More amused. Right? The silence stretched awkwardly. Dylan couldn't even look directly at him. He just kept stuffing random things into his bag while his heart beat like crazy. He expected Max to say it was a mistake, or maybe laugh it off like some drunk hookup after a party. Instead, Max just watched him carefully. Finally, Dylan muttered, "Last night was weird." "We're bad." Dylan opened his mouth, then closed it again. Because honestly, no. Last night hadn't felt bad at all. That was the problem. The conversation on the balcony had felt easy, comfortable. Max hadn't treated him like some random invisible student. He had listened when Dylan talked about books and classes and working late shifts at the bookstore cafe. He'd laughed at his sarcastic comments. He'd even admitted he hated most campus parties. And that kiss. Dylan pushed the thought away immediately. I should really go, he said quickly. Max nodded slowly, though his expression softened a little. Okay, but at least let me walk you out. That's not necessary. Dylan. The way Max said his name made his stomach twist. Reluctantly, Dylan followed him through the apartment. It was nicer than he expected, but surprisingly normal. No giant trophies everywhere. No messy party aftermath. A camera sat on the kitchen counter beside stacks of printed photographs. Near the window was an old piano with a hoodie thrown over the bench. Dylan blinked. You play piano? Max looked slightly embarrassed for the first time all morning. Sometimes. That caught Dylan off guard more than waking up in his bed. At the door, Max leaned casually against the frame. So, are you going to pretend you never met me now? Dylan swallowed hard. I don't know. Max studied him for a second before giving a small nod. Fair enough. Then Dylan left before his brain could completely short-circuit. The walk back to campus felt unreal. His phone buzzed nonstop inside his pocket, but he ignored it until he reached his dorm room and shut the door behind him. The second he checked his messages, regret hit instantly. Jace. Bro, where did you disappear to? Jace. Don't tell me you actually left with Holloway. Jace, dude, campus is already talking. Dylan groaned loudly and threw his phone onto the bed. Perfect. Exactly what he needed. The next few days were torture. Everywhere he went, it felt like people were staring. Maybe they actually were. Maybe it was paranoia. Either way, Dylan hated every second of it. At the student cafe, he overheard girls whispering about Max, supposedly leaving a party with some guy. In literature class, two students behind him mentioned seeing the basketball captain kissing someone during the blackout. Dylan immediately stopped going near the athletic buildings entirely. He changed routes between classes, ate lunch alone, ignored Jace's attempts to pry information out of him. Every time his phone buzzed, he panicked thinking it might be Max. But Max never texted. Part of Dylan hated how disappointed that made him feel. 3 days later, Dylan was working the evening shift at the campus bookstore cafe. It had been raining nonstop all afternoon, and business was dead. Honestly, he preferred it that way. Quiet felt safer. He was wiping down tables near closing time when the bell above the cafe door rang. Dylan looked up and nearly dropped the rag in his hand. Max Holloway stood there wearing a dark hoodie and basketball sweats, rain dripping from his blonde hair. Half the girls working nearby immediately noticed him. One of them nearly walked into a bookshelf. Max ignored everyone else completely. His eyes locked onto Dylan instantly. Dylan's pulse jumped. He walked over slowly. You've been avoiding me. Dylan kept wiping the table, even though it was already clean. You're imagining things. Am I? Yes. Dylan, you literally ran out of my apartment like the building was on fire. That's dramatic. You changed your route to class twice. Dylan finally looked up sharply. How do you know that? Max shrugged one shoulder. Because I notice you. That answer hit harder than it should have. Dylan looked away first. You shouldn't be here. Why? Because people might talk. They already are. Max stepped closer, lowering his voice. Do you regret it? The question sat heavily between them. Dylan opened his mouth automatically, ready to say yes. It would have been easier. Simpler. But the memory of that balcony flashed through his head again. Max sitting beside him while rain poured outside. Their shoulders touching. The way Max had looked at him before kissing him. No, Dylan admitted quietly. I don't regret it. Max's expression softened instantly. For a second, neither of them spoke. Then one of the cafe workers loudly whispered, "Holy crap," from behind the register. Dylan wanted the floor to swallow him whole. Max glanced toward the counter, then back at Dylan. Can we talk somewhere without an audience? We are not an audience. Another worker immediately muttered while pretending to organize cups. Dylan rubbed both hands over his face. I hate this campus. Max laughed softly. Come take a break. I'm working. You've been here 6 hours. How do you know that too? Again, Max only shrugged, slightly like it was obvious. Against all logic, Dylan followed him outside under the bookstore awning. Rain poured heavily onto the empty sidewalks around campus. For a minute, they just stood there listening to the storm. Then Max quietly said, I thought you'd text me. Dylan shoved his hands into his hoodie pockets. I didn't know what to say. You could have started with your number. That made Dylan laugh despite himself. Max smiled a little at the sound, but then his expression turned more serious. Look, I know this probably feels insane. I get it. But last weekend wasn't random for me. Dylan frowned slightly. What's that supposed to mean? Max leaned back against the brick wall beside him. You really think I just noticed you for the first time at that party? Dylan blinked. Max continued before he could answer. I've seen you around for months. At the library, the cafe, that poetry thing near the arts building. You saw that. You read a poem about feeling invisible. Max looked directly at him. I remembered that. Dylan honestly didn't know what to say after that. Nobody remembered things about him. Most people barely noticed him at all. Rain thundered loudly outside, while silence stretched between them again. Finally, Dylan muttered, that still doesn't explain why someone like you would even care. Max's eyebrows pulled together slightly. Someone like me? You know what I mean? No, actually, I don't. Dylan looked away. You're Max Holloway. And you're Dylan Carter. That's not remotely the same thing. Max stared at him for a long moment, before reaching into his hoodie pocket. He unfolded a small crumpled receipt and handed it over. Confused, Dylan looked down. On the back was a quick pencil sketch. It was him, sitting beside the bookstore window with headphones on and a coffee cup in his hands. Dylan looked up speechless. Max rubbed the back of his neck awkwardly. I drew that like 2 months ago during finals week. You sketch me? You look peaceful. Max paused. I like that. Dylan's chest tightened unexpectedly. Then Max stepped back toward the rain. Anyway, I should let you get back to work before your coworkers explode from curiosity. Dylan almost smiled. Before leaving, Max glanced back once more. You disappeared too fast that morning. Then he walked into the rain and disappeared down the sidewalk, leaving Dylan standing there holding the sketch with his heart beating harder than ever. The next couple of weeks felt strange in the best and worst possible way. Dylan kept telling himself whatever was happening with Max Holloway wasn't real. Guys like Max didn't quietly fall for bookstore workers who spent weekends hiding in campus libraries. But every time Dylan tried pulling away, Max somehow appeared again, like gravity itself kept dragging them back together. It started with small things. A coffee waiting for Dylan before his morning lecture. A text at 2 in the morning asking, "You awake?" A photo Max secretly took of rain hitting the basketball court with the caption, "Thought you'd like this." Dylan hated how much those messages mattered to him. One Thursday night, after closing the cafe, Dylan walked outside and nearly jumped when he saw Max leaning against a black SUV under the streetlights. Basketball practice had clearly just ended. His gray shirt clung to his chest with sweat, and his hair looked damp from the shower. "You stalking me now?" Dylan asked. "Depends. Is it working?" Dylan rolled his eyes, but the smile still slipped out. Max noticed immediately. "There it is." "What?" "That smile you pretend you don't have." Dylan shook his head. "You're annoying, and yet you keep talking to me." Before Dylan could answer, Max held up a paper bag. "Come eat with me." They ended up at a tiny 24-hour diner off campus, where nobody recognized Max for once. Dylan expected awkward silence, but somehow conversation with Max always felt easy. They argued over terrible songs on the diner jukebox, stole fries from each other's plates, and laughed hard enough that an old waitress told them to either date already or calm down. Dylan nearly choked on his drink. Max just grinned. After that night, things shifted. Max started bringing Dylan into parts of his life nobody else seemed to know about. One evening after practice, he led him into the empty basketball arena long after everyone had gone home. The massive court looked completely different without screaming crowds. "This is creepy," Dylan whispered. "It's peaceful." Max grabbed a basketball and tossed it toward him. Dylan barely caught it. "Oh no," Dylan immediately said. "Absolutely not. Come on. I'm terrible at basketball. That's why this is entertaining." 20 minutes later, Dylan was breathless from laughing while Max stood behind him trying to fix his shooting form. One large hand rested lightly on Dylan's wrist while the other adjusted his shoulders. "Bend your knees more," Max murmured near his ear. "This feels less like coaching and more like harassment." Max laughed softly against his neck. Dylan's entire body reacted instantly. For a second, neither of them moved. Then Max slowly lowered his hands, but stayed close enough that Dylan could feel the warmth coming off him. The air between them suddenly felt heavy. "You know," Max said quietly, "you talk a lot for someone supposedly shy." Dylan turned slightly. "Only around you." The words slipped out before he could stop them. Max looked genuinely caught off guard by that. Then slowly, carefully, he leaned down and kissed him. This one felt completely different from the drunken balcony kiss weeks ago. Slower, sober, real. Dylan kissed him back almost immediately. The basketball rolled forgotten across the empty court. After that night, the line between friendship and something much deeper completely disappeared. Sometimes Max stayed over at Dylan's dorm after late practices. Other nights Dylan ended up asleep on Max's couch while soft piano music played in the background. Max almost never talked while playing. He just sat there in low apartment lighting with rolled sleeves and tired eyes, while Dylan listened quietly from the couch, pretending his heart wasn't melting. One rainy night, Dylan finally asked, "Why do you hide this stuff?" Max glanced over from the piano. "Hide what?" "This." Dylan motioned around the apartment. "The piano." "Photography. You literally sketch people." Max looked down at the keys for a second. "Because nobody cares about that version of me." "That's not true." Max gave a quiet, humorless laugh. "Dylan, people care if I score points. That's about it." Dylan didn't know what to say to that. For the first time since meeting him, Max suddenly looked tired instead of confident. Without really thinking, Dylan walked over and sat beside him on the piano bench. Their shoulders touched lightly. "I care," Dylan said softly. Max stared at him for a second like those words genuinely mattered more than they should have. Then he kissed Dylan again. Slow at first. Careful. One hand gently holding the side of his neck. That night, Dylan fell asleep beside him for the first time without fear ruining the moment. But the outside world didn't stay quiet for long. Rumors around campus kept growing. At first it was whispers. Then photos started appearing online. Blurry images of Max leaving the bookstore cafe. A picture of someone wearing Max's hoodie that students swore was Dylan. One afternoon, Dylan walked into class and immediately heard someone whisper, "That's him." His stomach dropped. Later that evening, he sat silently in Max's apartment while scrolling through sports blogs on his phone. Mystery guy linked to basketball captain. Max Holloway hiding secret relationship. Dylan tossed the phone onto the couch. This is getting bad. Max looked up from the kitchen. People online talk about everything. You don't get it. No, I do. Dylan stood suddenly. No, you don't. They're obsessed with you, Max. If this gets worse. What? You think I'll suddenly regret you? Dylan froze. Max walked closer slowly. Is that honestly what you think? Dylan looked away first. Because part of him did think that. How could he not? Max had sponsors, interviews, fans, recruiters. Dylan had a bookstore apron and unresolved anxiety. Before he could answer, Max sighed quietly. Come here. Dylan hesitated but stepped closer anyway. Max wrapped both arms around him gently, pulling him against his chest. No teasing. No flirting. Just warmth. I'm still here, Max murmured against his hair. For a moment, Dylan let himself believe maybe that was enough. But things got worse a few days later. After one of Max's games, Dylan waited near the parking garage while crowds flooded out of the arena. He heard two students nearby talking before they noticed him standing there. Probably just experimenting. Yeah, athletes do that all the time. It'll blow over once he gets bored. Dylan walked away before hearing the rest. The words stayed stuck in his head for hours. By the time Max finally found him leaning against a concrete pillar in the nearly empty garage, Dylan's chest already felt tight with doubt. You disappeared after the game, Max said, slightly out of breath. Dylan shrugged. Crowds. Max studied him carefully. Something's wrong. No, I'm fine. Dylan. That tone always broke through him eventually. Dylan looked down. What if they're right? Who? The people talking about us. His voice came out quieter now. What if this is temporary for you? Max stared at him like the question physically hurt. Then suddenly he stepped forward, cupped Dylan's face with both hands, and kissed him hard. Not careful this time. Not hidden. Not uncertain. The parking garage lights flickered overhead while Dylan grabbed onto his jacket instinctively. When Max finally pulled back, both of them were breathing heavily. I am so tired, Max said quietly, forehead resting against his, of acting like loving you is something shameful. Dylan's heart slammed painfully against his ribs. Because deep down, he knew Max meant every word. For a little while after the parking garage kiss, Dylan actually let himself believe things might work out. It was stupid, probably naive, but being with Max started feeling less like a secret disaster waiting to happen and more like something real. They still kept things quiet in public, but behind closed doors, everything between them grew deeper fast. Too fast, maybe. Max started sleeping over at Dylan's dorm more often, usually sneaking in after late-night practices wearing hoodies and baseball caps like some terrible celebrity disguise. Sometimes they stayed awake until 3 in the morning talking about absolutely nothing. Other nights Dylan would wake up tangled against Max's chest while rain hit the dorm windows and Max's arm stayed, wrapped protectively around his waist. It scared him how safe it felt. That was the problem. The happier Dylan became, the more terrified he was of losing it. And eventually, the outside world caught up to them. It happened after another huge basketball win. The campus exploded into celebration almost immediately. Music blasted across fraternity houses, students flooded the streets, and social media was filled with clips of Max dominating the game. Dylan normally avoided those parties completely, but Max had texted him earlier. "Come tonight, please." So somehow Dylan ended up there anyway. The house was packed shoulder to shoulder with drunk students screaming over music. Max got dragged around constantly by teammates, fans, and people wanting pictures with him. Dylan mostly stayed near the kitchen, trying not to feel completely out of place. Every once in a while, Max would glance across the room toward him anyway, like he always knew exactly where Dylan was. Around midnight, Dylan finally slipped outside for air. The backyard overlooked the dark basketball arena in the distance, lights glowing faintly through the rain. A minute later, the back door opened behind him. "Thought I lost you," Max said softly. Dylan glanced over. Max had changed out of his jersey, but still looked flush from the game and the party. He walked closer until their shoulders brushed lightly beneath the covered patio. "You were busy being worshipped by half the campus," Dylan muttered. Max snorted. "You jealous?" "No. You're a terrible liar." Dylan rolled his eyes, but Max smiled anyway. For a while, they just stood there listening to distant thunder. Then Max quietly reached down and linked their fingers together. The simple gesture hit harder than any kiss. Dylan looked down at their hands. "You know somebody's eventually going to see us. Maybe I don't care anymore." Before Dylan could answer, a camera flash suddenly lit up the darkness. Both of them jerked apart instantly. A guy near the fence lowered his phone too slowly. Ricky Thompson, one of Max's teammates. His expression shifted from surprise to something much uglier. "Well," Ricky said slowly, "this is interesting." Max's jaw tightened immediately. "Deleted." Ricky laughed nervously. "Relax, man. I'm not posting anything." But the look in his eyes told Dylan otherwise. The next morning, the video was everywhere. Not blurry pictures, not rumors. An actual video. Max and Dylan holding hands beneath the patio lights before Max leaned down to kiss him. Dylan's phone nearly exploded with notifications. Group chats, messages, social media tags, missed calls from Jace. By the time he reached campus, students were openly staring. Someone whispered, "That's him." Another voice muttered, "Holy shit." Dylan immediately turned around and left before class even started. Meanwhile, the internet lost its mind. Some people were supportive. A lot weren't. Sports pages reposted the clip nonstop. Comment sections filled with arguments, jokes, and disgusting comments. Rumors spread that sponsors were furious. Reporters started waiting outside basketball practice, hoping Max would respond publicly. And through all of it, Max refused to deny anything. That only made everything bigger. 3 days later, Dylan sat silently inside Max's apartment while ESPN clips played muted on the television. Analysts discussed controversy surrounding university basketball star Max Holloway, like his relationship was some national emergency. Dylan felt sick. "This is my fault," he muttered. Max looked up immediately from the kitchen. "No. Yes, it is." "Dylan, you had endorsements before this. Recruiters. Interviews. Now people are talking about replacing you as captain." Max walked over quickly. "I don't care about that." "But I do." The words came out louder than Dylan intended. Silence filled the apartment. Dylan rubbed both hands over his face shakily. "You don't understand what this looks like from the outside. Then explain it to me." Dylan looked away. "It looks like your entire life is getting destroyed because of me." Max stepped closer. "Nothing is destroyed." Before Dylan could answer, Max's phone buzzed loudly on the counter. "Coach Reynolds." Max stared at the screen for a second before answering. Dylan listened quietly while Max's expression slowly darkened. "No," Max finally said coldly into the phone. "I'm not making some fake statement." Another pause. "I said no." Then he hung up. Dylan's stomach dropped. What did he want? Max leaned heavily against the counter. Sponsors are threatening to pull money from the program unless this dies down. Dylan felt like all the air disappeared from the room. There it was. The thing he'd been terrified of from the beginning. Max noticed his expression immediately. Dylan, don't. But it was too late. Old memories came rushing back hard enough to make him dizzy. Being cornered in high school bathrooms after someone outed him. Friends suddenly pretending not to know him. His father calling him disgusting during screaming matches at home. That same fear clawed back in his chest all over again. People always left once things became difficult. Eventually they would leave him too. Even Max. That night Dylan barely slept. By morning he had already made his decision. Quietly. Painfully. He packed a bag while Max was at practice. Then he left a short note on the kitchen counter. I'm sorry. That was it. No dramatic goodbye. No fight. Just fear winning again. Dylan stayed with his cousin nearly 3 hours away from campus. The apartment was tiny and smelled constantly like burnt coffee, but at least nobody there recognized him. Unfortunately, escaping campus didn't mean escaping Max. Everywhere online, people talked about him. Reporters followed Max after practices. Videos spread showing him arguing aggressively with paparazzi outside the arena. One clip even showed him shoving a microphone away after someone asked if the relationship phase had been worth damaging his career. Dylan stopped watching after that. But Jace kept texting constantly. You need to call him. He's a wreck. Seriously, Dylan. He looks awful. Dylan ignored every message. Because hearing about Max falling apart somehow hurt even worse. Then came the televised interview. Dylan almost missed it completely. He was sitting alone in his cousin's apartment, eating microwave noodles when sports coverage suddenly appeared on the TV. Max sat at the press table, still wearing his game jersey. He looked exhausted, dark circles beneath his eyes, jaw tight. A reporter immediately asked the question everyone had been waiting for. Max, do you want to address the rumors about your relationship? Dylan's chest tightened painfully. The room fell silent on television. The reporter continued carefully. There are concerns this situation may affect your future career prospects. Do you have any regrets about what happened? For a second, Max said nothing. Then slowly he leaned toward the microphone. First of all, he said calmly, he's not a situation. The room instantly went quiet. Max continued, voice rougher now. His name is Dylan. Dylan stopped breathing. And yeah, Max admitted, I'm in love with him. Cameras exploded with flashes. But Max kept going anyway. I know people want me to apologize or pretend this was some mistake. His jaw tightened slightly. It wasn't. One reporter tried interrupting with another question, but Max ignored him completely. Then quietly, honestly, he said the words that shattered Dylan completely. Losing him scares me a hell of a lot more than losing basketball. Dylan felt tears hit his face before he even realized he was crying. On the screen, Max stood up from the table while reporters shouted questions after him. But he never looked back. And sitting alone in that tiny apartment miles away from campus, Dylan finally realized the worst part of everything. Max had chosen him publicly, openly, without hesitation, and Dylan had still run away. Rain hammered against the bus windows the entire ride back to campus. Dylan barely noticed. Max's interview kept replaying in his head over and over until it felt impossible to think about anything else. He's not a situation. I'm in love with him. Losing him scares me more than losing basketball. Nobody had ever chosen Dylan like that before. Not publicly. Not when it cost something. His entire life, love had always come with conditions. Stay quiet. Don't make things difficult. Don't embarrass people. Don't be too much. But Max had stood in front of cameras and reporters and chosen him anyway. And Dylan had left him alone. The guilt sat heavily in his chest the entire trip home. By the time he stepped off the bus near campus, it was almost midnight. Rain soaked through his hoodie immediately as he walked through the nearly empty streets. Most dorm lights were dark now, but the basketball arena still glowed faintly in the distance. Dylan already knew where Max would be. The side entrance to the arena was unlocked, probably because nobody expected random students to wander inside during a storm at midnight. The massive court sat completely empty except for one person. Max. He stood near center court in gray sweatpants and a black hoodie, casually shooting basketballs alone beneath the dim overhead lights. The sound of the ball hitting hardwood echoed through the silent arena. For a second, Dylan just watched him. Even from far away, Max looked exhausted. Thinner somehow, like the past week had hollowed him out from the inside. Another shot bounced hard off the rim. Max cursed quietly under his breath before finally noticing movement near the entrance. The second he saw Dylan, the basketball slipped from his hands completely. Neither of them spoke. Rain pounded against the high arena windows while silence stretched painfully between them. Then Max finally whispered, "You came back." Dylan swallowed hard. "Yeah." Max walked toward him slowly, like he still wasn't completely sure this was real. Up close, the exhaustion on his face looked even worse. Dark circles beneath his eyes, stubble growing unevenly along his jaw. His normally steady expression looked cracked around the edges. "You disappeared," Max said quietly. The words weren't angry. That somehow hurt worse. Dylan looked down at the floor. "I know." For a moment, Max just stared at him. Then suddenly he laughed once under his breath, but there was no humor in it. "You know," he muttered, "I kept thinking maybe you'd text me eventually. Even just to tell me you hated me or something." "I don't hate you." "Then why did you leave?" There it was. The question Dylan had been avoiding since the second he ran. He opened his mouth once before closing it again, because the truth sounded pathetic out loud. Finally, he admitted quietly, "Because I got scared." Max's expression tightened slightly, but he stayed silent. Dylan forced himself to continue. Everything got so big so fast. Reporters, comments, people blaming me for your career falling apart. His voice cracked a little. "I thought eventually you'd realize I wasn't worth all of this." Max stared at him like the words physically hurt. "Dylan." "No, seriously." Dylan rubbed both hands over his face. "You had everything before me. Basketball, sponsors, your future. And I still chose you." The words cut through him instantly. Max stepped closer now, eyes locked onto his. "Do you really think any of that matters more to me than you do?" "You say that now." "I said it in front of national television." Dylan's breath caught. Max looked exhausted, frustrated, emotional all at once. "I'm so tired of trying to prove this to you." That hit harder than Dylan expected. Because Max was right. Even after everything, part of Dylan still kept waiting for him to leave. Years of fear didn't disappear overnight. Dylan looked down again. "Back in high school, when people found out about me, everybody changed. Friends stopped talking to me. My dad barely looked at me for months." His voice lowered. "I think part of me just learned to run before people could leave first." The confession hung heavily between them. Max's expression softened immediately. Slowly, carefully, he reached forward and took Dylan's hand. "I'm not them." Dylan's throat tightened painfully. "I know," he whispered. For the first time since they met, Max looked close to breaking too. "You leaving?" Max stopped talking for a second, jaw tightening hard. "That wrecked me." Dylan blinked in surprise. Max laughed quietly under his breath again, though his eyes looked suspiciously wet now. "Congratulations. You finally made the golden boy completely lose his mind." Despite everything, Dylan let out a small laugh. Max shook his head. "I couldn't sleep. Couldn't focus during practice. Every time my phone buzzed, I thought maybe it was you." He swallowed hard. And it never was. Guilt twisted painfully inside Dylan's chest. "I'm sorry." Max stepped even closer until barely any space remained between them. "Just tell me one thing honestly." "Okay. Do you still want this?" Dylan didn't even hesitate this time. "Yes." Max exhaled shakily like he'd been holding his breath for days. Then suddenly his hands were on Dylan's face, pulling him forward into a kiss. It wasn't careful. It wasn't slow. It felt desperate, relieved, emotional. Dylan kissed him back immediately, grabbing onto the front of Max's hoodie as weeks of fear, tension, and heartbreak finally cracked apart between them. When they finally pulled back, both of them were breathing hard. This time, Max murmured against his forehead, "Stay." Dylan nodded instantly. "I will." For the first time in weeks, Max finally smiled for real. The next few months weren't magically perfect after that, but they were better. Slowly, things started changing around campus. Not all at once. Not for everyone, but enough. Some teammates stayed awkward around Max for a while. A few avoided the topic completely. Others surprised them. Jace became aggressively supportive almost immediately. At one point, he literally shoved a guy against a locker after overhearing him insult Dylan. "You got a problem with him?" Jace snapped. "Say it louder." Nobody did. Even Coach Reynolds eventually stopped trying to convince Max to stay quiet. One afternoon after practice, he simply handed Max a bottle of water and muttered, "Your shooting's less terrible now that your boyfriend's back." Max nearly dropped the bottle. Online reactions slowly shifted too. The interview clips spread everywhere, but unexpectedly, support poured in alongside the criticism. LGBTQ sports organizations reposted it. Former athletes publicly defended Max. Students on campus started shutting down rumors instead of spreading them. For the first time, Dylan stopped feeling like everyone was staring at him with judgment. And for the first time in his life, he stopped hiding completely. He started reading poetry publicly again at open mic nights. Max attended every single one, always sitting in the front row, always looking ridiculously proud. Their relationship itself changed too, now that they weren't sneaking around anymore. The little things became Dylan's favorite part. Max waiting outside his literature classes with coffee. Late night grocery shopping together while arguing over cereal brands. Falling asleep on the couch during movie nights. Max absent-mindedly kissing the top of Dylan's head while cooking pasta. Normal things. Safe things. Things Dylan once thought he'd never have. Then championship finals arrived. The biggest game of the season. The entire arena was sold out hours early. Cameras crowded everywhere. Sports reporters filled entire rows near the court. Dylan nearly threw up from nerves before the game even started. "You look more stressed than the players," Jace laughed beside him in the stands. "I hate crowds. And yet you're dating the human version of a spotlight." Fair point. The game itself was brutal. Fast. Loud. Physical. But Max played like a man possessed. Every time Dylan thought the opposing team might pull ahead, Max somehow pushed harder. By the fourth quarter, the entire crowd was chanting his name so loudly the arena practically shook. Then came a final shot. 10 seconds left. Tie game. Max stole the ball, sprinted down court, and scored right before the buzzer exploded. The arena erupted instantly. People screamed. Confetti cannons fired. Teammates tackled Max near center court while cameras rushed toward him from every direction. Dylan smiled helplessly from the stands. There he was again. The campus superstar. The golden boy everyone loved. For a moment, Dylan just watched the celebration happen around him. Then suddenly Max looked up into the crowd. Straight at him. And instead of running toward reporters or trophies or cameras first, Max broke away from the team completely. The crowd roared louder in confusion as he sprinted toward the stands. Toward Dylan. By the time Max reached him, both of them were laughing breathlessly. "You're insane," Dylan said immediately. "Probably." Then Max grabbed him by the waist and kissed him in front of the entire arena. No hesitation. No fear. Just love. The crowd around them exploded even louder. When they finally pulled apart, Max rested his forehead against Dylan's and smiled softly. "Still think I'd ever let you go?" Dylan laughed quietly through burning eyes. "No." Months later, they moved into a small apartment near downtown together. It wasn't huge. The kitchen sink leaked sometimes, and the heater barely worked during winter mornings. But it was theirs. Dylan wrote poetry beside the apartment window while Max practiced shots at a nearby court before coming home exhausted every evening. Sometimes Max still played piano late at night. Sometimes Dylan still woke up afraid everything might disappear. But then Max would pull him closer half asleep and mumble, "You're overthinking again." And slowly, little by little, Dylan stopped being scared of happiness. One winter evening, while snow fell softly outside the apartment windows, Dylan stood in the kitchen making coffee when Max wrapped both arms around his waist from behind. "What?" Dylan laughed. "Nothing." Max kissed his forehead gently. And for the first time in both their lives, neither of them was hiding anymore. And that's how Dylan Carter stopped running from love, and how Max Holloway proved that sometimes the strongest person in the room isn't the one scoring points under stadium lights, it's the one brave enough to love openly. What started as one unexpected night turned into something real, messy, painful, and beautiful enough to change both their lives forever. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who loves emotional romance stories too. Thank you so much for listening all the way to the end, and I'll see you in the next story.